A racist neighbor called the police to a wedding party, leading to aggressive police response and arrests. However, when the identities of the bride and groom were revealed, the police's actions resulted in an unexpected outcome. Will the newlyweds be able to fight for justice? Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss new stories, and let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The soft evening light gently descended, casting a warm golden glow over the neatly trimmed hedges of the upscale neighborhood, making everything appear more dazzling. The spacious backyard of the luxurious house turned into the perfect romantic setting, with twinkling string lights hanging above, peeking through the trees. The cheerful laughter of the guests filled the air, blending with the soft music to create an atmosphere brimming with joy and happiness. A gentle breeze carried the sweet fragrance of flowers from the carefully arranged banquet tables, adding even more romance to the outdoor wedding celebration. Standing amidst this scene was Sophia Bennett, a well-known judge with a reputation for integrity and a steadfast commitment to justice. She looked radiant in her pristine white wedding dress, a glowing smile on her face, reflecting her happiness and contentment. Beside her stood John Bennett, her newlywed husband and a senior FBI agent. He stood tall and strong, his eyes full of admiration for Sophia. The couple appeared to be the embodiment of love and hope, something that every guest could feel in the way they looked at each other and exchanged smiles. This wedding was not just a simple event to mark their union, but a symbol of the life they had built together. The house where the ceremony was held was the result of years of hard work and shared dreams. John had devoted much time and effort to transforming the garden into a space that was both cozy and open, a place where people could gather and share in the joy of the couple's big day. Surrounding them, family and friends were full of joy. Sophia's parents chatted with the guests, proudly talking about the achievements of their daughter, while John's family, many of whom had traveled far to be there, laughed and raised glasses to toast the newlyweds' future. Children ran around the yard, their laughter echoing through the air, adding to the lively and cheerful atmosphere. For everyone present, this seemed like the perfect evening, a place where love, unity, and hope reigned. However, alongside the warmth and joy, something unexpected was quietly brewing. In a house not far away, an elderly woman, Mrs. Collins, sat in her living room, quietly watching through her thin curtains. She had lived in the neighborhood for many years, known for her critical nature and her tendency to keep a close eye on everything happening around her. And tonight, her gaze was fixed on the wedding. But instead of feeling joy or curiosity, she felt resentment at seeing some guests she believed were out of place in this neighborhood. In her heart, a sense of anger arose, a deep-rooted anger shaped by years of racist thoughts and attitudes within the community. Mrs. Collins couldn't sit still any longer. Watching the wedding party through her window, she felt a growing discomfort. The laughter and music from the party echoed into her home like an unbearable disturbance. But what bothered her more than the sound was the people attending, faces she considered unfit for this upscale neighborhood. She had lived there, her entire life, in a place where wealthy and powerful families lived in safety and order. And now, a crowded wedding with guests she deemed strangers was ruining it all. How could this be allowed to happen? She muttered to herself, shaking her head. In her mind, long-held racial prejudices surfaced. Mrs. Collins felt she had to do something to restore order. Without hesitation, she reached for the phone, her thin, frail hand trembling with anger. She dialed the police with the familiarity of someone who had done this many times before. "This neighborhood is being disturbed," she shouted as the phone connected. Her voice was sharp and firm, and she quickly began fabricating a story about excessive noise and suspicious activity she claimed was happening. "There are suspicious people at that house," she continued, deliberately exaggerating the situation. Her voice carried underlying racist tones, implying that the wedding guests were untrustworthy, maybe even criminals. "They could be doing something illegal. You need to come here right away," she said with certainty. At the police station, a dispatcher received Mrs. Collins' call. With a serious expression, he took note of the noise complaints and the suspicions she mentioned. Although there was no concrete evidence, words like suspicious people and possible illegal activity were enough to catch the attention of the police. Calls from such quiet, affluent areas were rare, so the dispatcher immediately felt this could be a case worth investigating. After a few minutes of discussion, He relayed the information, and a police unit was sent to investigate. Meanwhile, in the backyard, Sophia and John were still immersed in the joyous atmosphere of their wedding. Laughter and conversations filled the air as guests continued to enjoy the celebration and toast the newlyweds. Sophia and John stood among their friends and family, their eyes shining with happiness. None of them knew that just a few blocks away, a group of police officers was on its way, bringing with them a storm of tension and trouble. John stood near a group of guests chatting about future plans, smiling as he listened to humorous stories. Sophia was reminiscing about childhood memories with her best friend from high school, both of them laughing as they recalled silly moments from the past. Children ran around the garden, their innocent laughter blending with the festive atmosphere. But while the joyful mood filled the garden, a dark cloud was silently approaching. Within minutes, the sound of car engines began to hum in the distance, breaking the peace of the party. The flashing red and blue lights of police cars flickered through the trees, reflecting off the house windows. One of the youngest guests at the party, while playing outside, accidentally spotted the police lights. "What's going on?" he called out, causing a few others to turn around. One by one, people began to notice the presence of the police, their eyes filled with curiosity and concern spreading quickly through the crowd. Sophia, noticing the change in the atmosphere, turned to John. Her smile slowly faded, replaced by confusion and a bit of worry. "What's happening?" she asked, her voice soft but tinged with concern. John turned as well, looking toward the gate, where the red and blue lights were growing closer. He could feel the shift in the air and sense that something wasn't right. Squeezing Sophia's hand gently, he tried to stay calm. "I'm not sure, but it looks like we need to go out and see what's going on," he replied, trying to reassure his wife. As the couple moved toward the front gate, they saw police cars pulling up outside on the street. The car doors opened and officers stepped out, their expressions stern and cautious. They adjusted their belts, their hands hovering near their guns and batons, as if they were ready to face a dangerous situation. The officers exchanged quick words with each other, their eyes scanning the garden where the party was in full swing, not betraying any indication that they were standing before a normal wedding celebration. The mood at the wedding immediately turned tense. The previous laughter was now replaced with worried whispers. Guests looked at each other, some starting to murmur questions about why the police were there. Sophia and John moved closer, their eyes meeting in shared concern as both of them sensed something bad was about to unfold. "Sophia," John whispered, still holding her hand tightly. "We need to stay calm, but clearly, something's not right." Sophia nodded slightly, feeling a growing sense of unease. They didn't know exactly what was waiting for them ahead, but it was clear that this was no ordinary inspection, and certainly not a small misunderstanding. Together they stepped forward to meet the officers, determined to handle the situation peacefully, though both felt an ominous foreboding. As they neared the gate, Sophia and John could see the police officers more clearly, about 4 of them having a quick discussion before moving into the garden. Their eyes were serious and their attitude unfriendly, making the atmosphere even more tense. Sophia, as the homeowner, stepped forward with a warm smile and began speaking. "Hello, officers. I'm Sophia, and this is my husband, John. We're hosting a wedding here. Is there something that brought you to us?" A tall police officer, who seemed to be the leader, glanced at her coldly, showing no sign of responding to her friendliness. "We received a report of loud noise and suspicious activity here. We need to check the area and verify the information." John could feel the hostility in the officer's voice and expression. He stepped forward, trying to keep his tone calm. "This is just a family wedding. We have all the permits and paperwork for the event. There's nothing illegal happening here." However, John's explanation did nothing to ease the officer's suspicion. The commanding officer didn't listen, but instead signaled to the other officers to spread out around the area. "We'll do our own checks," he said curtly, allowing no room for objections. Sophia frowned, realizing that the situation was more complicated than she had thought. "Officers," she said, this time with a more serious tone. "As I mentioned, this is a family event, and we are not breaking any laws. If you have any questions, we are more than willing to answer, but there's no reason for you to conduct such an inspection." The officer seemed uninterested in her words. Instead, he turned his back and walked away, while the other officers began to enter the garden, moving closer to the crowd of guests Some guests were starting to realize that something was wrong, whispering among themselves, their faces filled with concern as they saw the police. Sophia and John felt powerless as the officers ignored their words and walked past. John looked at his wife, his eyes filled with tension. "What should we do now?" he asked quietly. Sophia took a deep breath, trying to remain calm. "We need to keep our cool," she said. "They're acting unreasonably, but we can't let things escalate. We'll handle this legally." Meanwhile, the commanding officer ordered one of the other officers to start questioning the guests. The festive atmosphere of the wedding quickly shifted from joyful to tense. Guests began to feel confused as police approached them with rude, suspicious questions. Some older guests felt frightened by the cold and unfriendly demeanor of the officers. The children, who had been playing just moments before, had now stopped and were staring, wide-eyed, at the unfamiliar uniformed strangers. One of the officers began questioning each guest, but the way they asked questions didn't feel like casual inquiries. It felt more like an interrogation. "Where are you from? Why are you here?" The unfriendly tone made the guests feel uneasy, unsure of whether they had done something wrong. From a distance, Sophia watched this scene unfold, her anger rising. She knew her rights and those of everyone present, but dealing with such blatant abuse of authority was no simple task. John also realized that the situation was spiraling out of control. He began to feel the growing tension, especially when one of the officers approached a group of younger guests, including a boy around 13, Sophia's nephew. John couldn't stay silent any longer. He quickly walked over to the group of officers, his voice low but clear. "What are you doing? That's my nephew. There's no reason to question or check him." The officer turned to John, his eyes full of defiance. "We have the right to investigate anyone we deem necessary," he said coldly. "If you don't cooperate, we'll have to take action." John looked deep into the officer's eyes, sensing his unreasonable determination. "You don't have the right to search children without just cause," John said, his voice calm but tense. Sophia stood beside him, placing her hand on his shoulder as a reminder to stay calm. But she knew this was no longer a simple routine check. She could feel the tension building as the officers continued to overstep their boundaries, despite every reasonable explanation they had given. The joyful atmosphere of the party had almost completely vanished, replaced by widespread anxiety throughout the garden. John, despite his attempts to stay composed, couldn't deny the simmering anger within him. He turned back to the officer, still standing near his nephew, and spoke again, this time with more seriousness. "This is just a family wedding. There's no reason for you to treat our guests like criminals. Stop now before this goes too far." But the officer didn't back down. He looked at John, his gaze cold and challenging. "We're here to ensure safety," he responded. "If you don't want trouble, it's best you cooperate." Meanwhile, the other officers continued to move throughout the garden, questioning each guest with increasing disrespect. Simple explanations from the guests were dismissed, replaced with a barrage of aggressive questions. Elderly guests began to feel unsafe, while the children stood huddled, confused as to why the fun party had turned into such a tense situation. An older guest, Mrs. Margaret, a close family friend, stepped forward and tried to mediate. "Officers, this is just a misunderstanding. We're all family and friends of the bride and groom. There's nothing to be concerned about here." But the officer only glanced at Mrs. Margaret, showing no concern. "Step aside, ma'am. We'll verify this ourselves," he said, his voice curt and lacking respect. Sophia, witnessing this, felt a surge of uncontrollable anger rising within her. She had tried to stay calm, but the officer's increasingly over-the-top behavior had crossed the line. She stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "You're going too far. This is a legal event, and you have no right to treat us like suspects. If you don't stop, I'll have no choice but to involve legal action." But instead of listening, the commanding officer looked at Sophia with a sneer. "Who do you think you are to say that?" he asked, his tone full of challenge. "We received a report of suspicious activity, and we have the right to investigate." John, sensing the tension in Sophia's voice, tried to step in to calm things down. "Sophia, we need to stay calm," he said quietly, but his own eyes reflected the worry he couldn't hide. He knew that if things continued down this path, the situation would soon spiral out of control. However, the situation was already beginning to slip out of anyone's control. As one of the police officers moved closer to a group of younger guests, demanding identification, one of the young guests, confused as to why he was being interrogated, protested, "Why do we have to show ID? This is just a wedding party." His protest was like a spark in the tinderbox of tension that had been building. The officer immediately became more aggressive, threatening, "You don't want trouble, do you? Show your ID now." Fear and frustration quickly spread through the party. The guests could no longer remain calm. Voices of protest began to rise, and the atmosphere grew increasingly stifling. Some guests, feeling insulted by the police's attitude, started speaking up in defense of one another, trying to stay calm but realizing that tension was rapidly escalating. Sophia turned back to look at John, a strange sense of helplessness in her eyes. They had tried to explain, tried to keep everything under control, but it all seemed to be slipping beyond their reach. John squeezed his wife's hand gently, trying to offer her some comfort. "We have to stay calm, Sophia," he said. "But it's clear they didn't come here to listen to us. This is going in a very bad direction." The mood of the party had now completely changed. From a joyous wedding celebration, the backyard had become a place filled with tension, where everyone felt scrutinized and oppressed by those who were supposed to protect them. John could clearly sense the frustration building in the guests, and he himself could no longer stay still. He quickly approached the commanding officer, his voice low but firm. "You have no right to act this way. This is a legal wedding, and we're not breaking any laws." The commanding officer looked at John, his eyes gleaming with challenge. "That's not for you to decide," he replied, his voice full of arrogance. "We received a report, and we have the right to investigate anyone we see fit. If you don't cooperate, things will get much more complicated." Sophia, standing nearby, could no longer hold back. She stepped forward, her voice louder and more determined than ever. "I am Judge Sophia Bennett, and I know the law very well. You are abusing your power, and you have no justifiable reason to treat our guests like criminals. We demand that you stop immediately." The revelation of Sophia's identity caused some of the officers to hesitate for a moment, but the commanding officer remained cold. He sneered slightly. "A judge, huh? That doesn't change the fact that we need to do our job. If you keep interfering, we'll have to take action." John stepped forward, positioning himself in front of Sophia, his gaze resolute. "You're overstepping," he said, his voice growing colder. "We haven't broken any laws, and we won't allow you to violate our rights. If you continue, we will take you to court." The firmness in John and Sophia's stance seemed to irritate the commanding officer. "Are you threatening me?" he growled, his hand hovering near his gun as a warning. "If you don't back down right now, we'll arrest you for obstructing law enforcement." Sophia and John stood their ground, unwilling to back down. The guests around them began to grow more anxious, some whispering among themselves, while others stood up, showing their support for the couple. Scattered voices of protest began to rise from the crowd. "You can't do this! This is a wedding, not a crime scene." However, those protests only seemed to heighten the tension. A young officer, perhaps unfamiliar with handling resistance, stepped forward and began ordering a group of guests, including children, to line up for ID checks. When one of them refused, calling it ridiculous, the officer became angry and threatened to arrest them if they didn't comply. John couldn't take it anymore. He walked up to the young officer, his voice low but filled with determination. "You have no right to do that. These are our children, and you have no reason to demand their IDs." The young officer turned to John with a look of frustration, his hand hovering near his baton. "If you say another word, I'll arrest you for resisting," he threatened. Sophia, despite being used to handling tense situations in court, now felt both angry and anxious. She knew the situation was quickly spiraling out of control, but she couldn't let this continue. As a judge, she felt responsible for standing up for her and her guests' rights. "You can't do this," Sophia shouted, her voice stronger than ever. "This is blatant abuse of power, and you will pay for this." The commanding officer, having lost all patience, ordered the officers to enforce stricter control. Several officers began dividing the guests into smaller groups and demanded identification. The guests, from the elderly to small children, were treated like suspects. From initial surprise, they gradually became angry and indignant. A family friend, Lawyer David, John's brother, stepped forward with a firm voice. I am a lawyer, and I can confirm that everything you are doing is a violation of the law. If you do not stop immediately, we will sue you for abuse of power. But instead of backing down, the commanding officer just looked at David with contempt. A lawyer? That doesn't change anything. If you continue to cause trouble, we won't hesitate to use force. That statement served as a final warning, making the atmosphere even more tense. Sophia and John realized the situation had spiraled out of control, and worse might be on the horizon. Before they could react, the tension exploded. A police officer, while interrogating a young boy, forcefully pushed him forward when he hesitated to present his documents. The boy stumbled, his frightened eyes darting toward his parents standing nearby. The scene immediately descended into chaos. Some nearby guests started shouting, protesting the officer's rough actions, while others rushed forward to protect the child. John, unable to restrain himself any longer, surged forward. "Stop it now!" he shouted at the officer who had pushed the child, his eyes blazing with fury. "You cannot treat children like this!" The officer, with a tense and angry expression, turned to face John. "Stand back," he commanded, raising his hand to grab his baton. "If you don't back down, I'll arrest you immediately." John did not back down. He took another step forward, pointing at the officer, his voice seething. "You have no right to abuse your authority like this. This is a wedding, not a crime scene." Unable to tolerate John's defiance, the officer swung at him, preparing to strike. But before the blow could land, John reacted quickly, grabbing the officer's wrist and holding it tight. The two stood face to face for a few seconds, the air thick with extreme tension. Immediately, other officers rushed in, surrounding John. One officer shouted, "Arrest him! He just assaulted a police officer!" And in the blink of an eye, they forcefully shoved John to the ground. Guests screamed as the police restrained him, pinning him down harshly on the grass. Sophia, seeing her husband being taken down, felt a surge of fear and anger rising within her. "John!" she yelled, running towards him, but another officer quickly blocked her. "Don't move!" he ordered, raising his hand as if ready to arrest her at any moment. Sophia paused momentarily, but her eyes never left John. She took a deep breath and spoke loudly in the commanding voice of a judge. "You are violating our rights. You have no right to arrest or treat us like criminals without just cause." But her words fell on deaf ears. The commanding officer, long since out of patience, wasn't listening. "Arrest her too," he ordered with authority. "They're disrupting and obstructing our work." Immediately, another officer grabbed Sophia's arm. She was shoved back, her hands twisted behind her, and within seconds, cold handcuffs were clamped tightly around her wrists. "You're breaking the law!" Sophia shouted, but her words did nothing to stop them. Meanwhile, John was being pinned down, his hands also cuffed, even though he didn't resist. The guests around them were in panic. Some tried to intervene, but they were blocked by a wall of police officers. Some started recording the scene, hoping the footage would serve as evidence to seek justice later. The atmosphere in the garden had now turned into a battlefield. Shouts and cries echoed from all directions, and the police lights flashed like cold, ruthless streaks of light, cutting through the night. Children who had been playing happily just moments ago now clung tightly to their parents, trembling in fear. Some of the elderly had been knocked down or separated from their families. Sophia was dragged towards the police car, her eyes scanning the chaotic scene. Her heart sank as she saw an elderly relative being pulled forward, nearly exhausted, and a young child being torn away from its mother's arms. "You will pay for this," she said, her voice full of anger and resolve. But the police did not stop. A commanding officer barked orders. "Continue the search. Check everyone." As she was shoved into the back of the police car, Sophia felt the injustice more clearly than ever. She turned to look at John, who was also being dragged away, and their eyes met in a brief moment that conveyed all their determination and pain. They knew their battle was far from over, but they would not give up. They would not let this injustice happen without fighting to the very end. As Sophia and John were pushed into the police car, a frightening silence fell over the garden. The guests, stunned, began to rise in outrage. Cries for justice, sobbing, and shouts of anger erupted from all directions, and a few brave guests started demanding the police stop this brutal behavior. It was at that moment that Sophia decided she could no longer remain silent. She knew her authority and identity could change the situation. She gathered all her composure, her voice cutting through the tense air, strong and clear. "I am Judge Sophia Bennett, and you are breaking the law." That statement rippled through the crowd and even the police force. A moment of extreme tension-filled silence enveloped everyone, including the officers, as they realized who they had just handcuffed and arrested. Some officers exchanged bewildered glances, clearly sensing the growing anxiety. The commanding officer, still standing in front, frowned but didn't seem overly surprised. He looked at Sophia with mockery, his cold voice ringing out, "A judge? That changes nothing. You could be anyone, but you're obstructing our duty, and there are no exceptions for that." Sophia, maintaining her calm but firm demeanor, pressed on. "I am a judge, and I know my rights very well. What you are doing today is an abuse of power, and I guarantee everything you're doing has been recorded. You will pay for what you've done." Meanwhile, John, who was being restrained not far away, decided to reveal his identity to support his wife's claim. He raised his head, his voice resolute. "I am John Bennett, a senior FBI agent. I know the law and law enforcement procedures better than anyone here. What you're doing today has crossed the line and will be investigated." This revelation sent a wave of murmurs through the officers. Some began stepping back, worried they had made a serious mistake. The commanding officer, despite trying to maintain his tough exterior, was clearly losing control of the situation. He glanced at Sophia and John with hostility, but he couldn't deny that the situation was far more serious than he had anticipated. "Judge? FBI agent?" a young officer muttered, his face full of doubt and regret. He turned to his commanding officer, clearly unsure of what to do next. "What should we do now?" Sensing his team's wavering, the commanding officer stepped closer, his cold voice trying to maintain authority. "Do you think that being a judge or an FBI agent means you're above the law? Here, we have the right to investigate, and you two are obstructing our work. Your titles mean nothing here." Sophia stared directly into the commanding officer's eyes, her gaze burning with resolve. "No one is above the law," she said, her voice steady. "Exactly, but that applies to you too. What you're doing today is not just a minor misunderstanding. It will be a serious case of abuse of power, and I promise you, everything will be thoroughly investigated." The commanding officer, growing impatient, signaled for the officers to continue controlling the crowd. But before anyone could make another move, some guests had already started sharing the videos they'd taken on social media, and immediately, the situation worsened for the police. Phones in the officers' hands began buzzing with calls and messages from superiors. They began to realize that every action they took that night had been recorded and could become a major scandal. One of the older officers, who had been observing from a distance, approached the commanding officer and whispered something in his ear. The commanding officer turned, his face clearly showing frustration. Without saying another word, he signaled for the other officers to start releasing the detained individuals, including Sophia and John. As Sophia's handcuffs were removed, she looked directly at the commanding officer, her voice still calm but filled with power. "Remember, everything you did tonight will come with consequences. We will not remain silent." The commanding officer didn't reply, but his eyes were filled with worry, knowing the situation had spiraled out of his control. Other officers began backing away, clearly concerned about the consequences of their actions. Sophia and John stood in the garden, their eyes full of determination as they looked at each other. This was only the beginning, and they would not stop until justice was served. The police officers, fully aware that the situation had slipped out of their control, slowly retreated. The commanding officer, though trying to maintain composure, could not hide the growing anxiety spreading through his ranks. He signaled for the other officers to begin removing the handcuffs and releasing those who had been detained, including Sophia and John. The tension began to ease, but no one present could forget the injustice they had just witnessed. Guests began to rise, watching as the officers quietly gathered their equipment and slowly backed away from the scene. Some in the crowd, who had been recording the entire event on their phones, continued filming to ensure that nothing was left undocumented. Rumors of abuse of power started to spread, and many began to understand that this incident would not end quietly. Sophia, her eyes still filled with both anger and determination, stepped toward the commanding officer as he prepared to leave the garden. Remember, she said coldly, her voice clear. This is not the end. What you did today will be investigated, and you will be held accountable. You cannot hide your abuse of power. The commanding officer turned, his face hardening, clearly uncomfortable as he faced the reality that this situation had become a scandal beyond his control. We were just doing our duty, he replied curtly, but the confidence in his voice had waned. John, still standing beside Sophia, now spoke as well. We will not let this go unnoticed. My wife and I both understand the law, and we will ensure that every violation today is brought to light. He looked directly at the commanding officer, his eyes sharp and unwavering, reinforcing his statement. The commanding officer hesitated for a moment, then ordered his remaining officers to retreat. Under the weight of the crowd's gaze and the feeling that every move they made was being watched and recorded, the officers quietly left the scene. But the tension they left behind lingered in the garden like a mark of injustice. After the police had gone, the atmosphere gradually returned to a calmer state, but the wedding celebration had been completely ruined. Guests gathered around Sophia and John, sharing their anger and concern about what had just happened. The elderly guests were still in shock, and the children clung tightly to their parents, their wide eyes filled with fear. Sophia looked around the garden, seeing the worried faces, the smiles that had vanished, and the initial joy now replaced by shock and anger. Her heart felt heavy, knowing that this night, instead of being the happiest day of their lives, had become a symbol of abuse of power. But at the same time, she felt a rising sense of determination that could not be extinguished. She would not let this pass in vain. John stepped forward, placing a hand on his wife's shoulder, his eyes filled with the same determination as hers. We will fight to the end, he said softly but firmly. Everything changed from that moment, and we must make them understand that they cannot continue to abuse power without facing consequences. Sophia nodded, her eyes glowing with resolve. We are not just fighting for ourselves, she said, her voice growing stronger. We will fight for everyone who has been treated unjustly like we have, for those without a voice, and for the legal system we believe in. The guests around them began to offer support, some offering legal help, while others encouraged Sophia and John to continue their fight. These expressions of solidarity strengthened both of them, reminding them that they were not alone in this battle. Soon the videos of the entire incident spread quickly across social media. Thousands of people began sharing, commenting, and the case quickly became a national focus. Criticism of police abuse of power, questions about discrimination, and calls for investigation spread rapidly. With the support of family, friends, and even distant supporters, Sophia and John began preparing for their legal battle. Renowned lawyers reached out to them, offering assistance in suing the police department and the officers involved in the abuse of power. This was not just a lawsuit for compensation. They knew this would be a fight to change the behavior of law enforcement officers, to ensure that injustices like this would no longer occur. Sophia and John, hand in hand, knew that this battle would not be easy, but they were ready to face it. Shortly after the incident, they and their legal team began preparing for the lawsuit. With evidence from the videos showing the abuse of power and widespread public support, the case quickly gained significant media attention and interest from human rights organizations. Within a few days, the story of the wedding ruined by police abuse had become headlines in major newspapers and spread widely across social media. The country expressed outrage at the police's actions, and growing pressure forced authorities to launch an investigation. The city police chief quickly spoke out, promising a thorough investigation and ensuring that the officers involved would be held accountable. Meanwhile, Sophia and John continued to receive support from all sides. Human rights organizations, the legal community, and others who had experienced abuse of power rallied behind them, turning this incident into a symbol of the fight against police discrimination and abuse of authority. In court, Sophia and John did not just appear as victims, but as champions of justice. They brought not only witness testimonies and video evidence, but also the spirit of those who sought to change a system that lacked fairness. Sophia, with her deep legal knowledge, made solid arguments, pointing out every mistake the police had made that night. John, with his years of experience in the FBI, provided insightful analysis of the police's procedural failures. The trial lasted for weeks and captivated national attention. During the hearings, a range of issues about racial discrimination and abuse of power in the police system were brought to light. Finally, the court ruled in favor of Sophia and John. The officers directly involved in the incident were suspended and faced criminal charges, while the police department was held responsible for compensating those present at the event. But for Sophia and John, this was not just a personal victory. Their lawsuit had sparked a powerful movement, leading to discussions about police reform across the country. They had become symbols of the fight against injustice and abuse of power, inspiring others to stand up for their rights. After the trial, Sophia and John stepped out of the courthouse to the support of hundreds of people who had followed and cheered them throughout the tense legal battle. Their eyes were filled with determination and gratitude, but they also knew this was only one step in a long journey toward changing the system. Sophia addressed the crowd and the press, her voice firm yet emotional. Today, we have won an important battle, but the fight for justice is far from over. What happened to us is not just the story of a ruined wedding. It is the story of millions of people across this country who have been treated unjustly. We will continue to fight, and we will not stop until abuse of power no longer exists in the system. John, standing beside his wife, placed his hand on her shoulder and continued, "We know that justice doesn't come immediately, and it is not easy. But we are committed to continuing this journey, not just for ourselves, but for all those who have been stripped of their freedom, respect, and dignity. This is not the end, but a new beginning." The crowd erupted in applause, cheering for Sophia and John, who had become the voices of the fight against injustice. With every step forward, they knew they were not just fighting for their justice, but opening the door for many others. Their wedding, though ruined by abuse of power, had become a symbol of courage, determination, and the strength of those who refused to accept injustice. As the day ended and the last light of the sun set on the horizon, Sophia and John walked together, knowing that their journey was far from over. But they were not alone. Their story would live on, becoming a beacon of hope for future struggles for justice. Sophia and John's story is not just a journey to reclaim justice for themselves, but a reminder of the power of courage, steadfastness, and unity in the face of injustice. They proved that even when treated unfairly, we must never remain silent. Only by standing up for our rights and the rights of others can we change the system and build a more just society. Their journey reminds us that justice does not always come immediately, but it will come if we continue to fight. Every voice, every action can make a difference, and everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. If this story has touched you, please support us by clicking subscribe so you don't miss future stories about justice, courage, and life lessons. Let's spread this positive message and inspire many more. Thank you for following, and see you in the next stories.